Chapter 9 of A Phantom Lover by Vernon Lee. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I had begun Mrs. Oke's portrait, and she was giving me a sitting. She was unusually quiet that morning, but it seemed to me with the quietness of a woman who is expecting something, and she gave me the impression of being extremely happy. She had been reading, at my suggestion, the Vita Nuova, which she did not know before, and the conversation came to turn upon that, and upon the question whether love so abstract and so enduring were a possibility. Such a discussion, which might have savored of flirtation in the case of almost any other young and beautiful woman, became in the case of Mrs. Oke something quite different. It seemed distant, intangible, not of this earth, like her smile and the look in her eyes. "Such love as that," she said, looking into the far distance of the oak-dotted parkland, "is very rare. But it can exist. It becomes a person's whole existence, his whole soul. And it can survive the death, not merely of the beloved, but of the lover. It is unextinguishable, and goes on in the spiritual world until it meet a reincarnation of the beloved, and when this happens, it jets out and draws to it all that may remain of the lover's soul, and takes shape and surrounds the beloved one once more." Mrs. Oke was speaking slowly, almost to herself, and I had never, I think, seen her look so strange and so beautiful. The stiff white dress bringing out but the more the exotic exquisiteness and incorporealness of her person. I did not know what to answer, so I said, half in jest, "I fear you have been reading too much Buddhist literature, Mrs. Oke. There is something dreadfully esoteric in all you say." She smiled contemptuously. "I know people can't understand such matters," she replied, and was silent for some time. But through her quietness and silence I felt, as it were, the throb of a strange excitement in this woman, almost as if I had been holding her pulse. Still, I was in hopes that things might be beginning to go better in consequence of my interference. Mrs. Oke had scarcely once alluded to Lovelock in the last 2 or 3 days, and Oke had been much more cheerful and natural since our conversation. He no longer seemed so worried, and once or twice I had caught in him a look of great gentleness and loving kindness, almost of pity, as towards some young and very frail thing, as he sat opposite his wife. But the end had come. After that sitting, Mrs. Oke had complained of fatigue, and retired to her room, and Oke had driven off on some business to the nearest town. I felt all alone in the big house, and after having worked a little at a sketch I was making in the park, I amused myself rambling about the house. It was a warm, enervating autumn afternoon, the kind of weather that brings the perfume out of everything, the damp ground and fallen leaves, the flowers in the jars, the old woodwork and stuffs, that seems to bring on to the surface of one's consciousness all manner of vague recollections and expectations, a something half pleasurable, half painful, that makes it impossible to do or to think. I was the prey of this particular, not at all unpleasurable restlessness. I wandered up and down the corridors, stopping to look at the pictures, which I knew already in every detail, to follow the pattern of the carving and old stuffs, to stare at the autumn flowers arranged in magnificent masses of color in the big china bowls and jars. I took up one book after another and threw it aside. Then I sat down to the piano and began to play irrelevant fragments. I felt quite alone, although I had heard the grind of the wheels on the gravel, which meant that my host had returned. I was lazily turning over a book of verses, I remember it perfectly well, it was Morris's Love is Enough, in a corner of the drawing room, when the door suddenly opened and William Oke showed himself. He did not enter, but beckoned to me to come out to him. There was something in his face that made me start up and follow him at once. He was extremely quiet, even stiff, not a muscle of his face moving, but very pale. "I have something to show you," he said, leading me through the vaulted hall, hung round with ancestral pictures, into the gravelled space that looked like a filled-up moat, where stood the big, blasted oak with its twisted, pointing branches. I followed him on to the lawn, or rather the piece of park land that ran up to the house. We walked quickly, he in front, without exchanging a word. Suddenly he stopped, just where there jutted out the bow window of the yellow drawing-room, and I felt Oke's hand tight upon my arm. "I have brought you here to see something," he whispered hoarsely, and he led me to the window. I looked in. The room, compared with outdoors, was rather dark, but against the yellow wall I saw Mrs. Oke sitting alone on a couch in her white dress, her head slightly thrown back, a large red rose in her hand. "Do you believe now?" whispered Oke's voice, hot at my ear. "Do you believe now? Was it all my fancy? But I will have him this time. I have locked the door inside, and by heaven, he shan't escape." The words were not out of Oke's mouth. I felt myself struggling with him silently outside that window, but he broke loose, pulled open the window, and leaped into the room, and I after him. As I crossed the threshold, something flashed in my eyes. There was a loud report, a sharp cry, and the thud of a body on the ground. Oke was standing in the middle of the room, with a faint smoke about him, and at his feet, sunk down from the sofa, with her blonde head resting on its seat, lay Mrs. Oke, a pool of red forming in her white dress. Her mouth was convulsed, as if in that automatic shriek, but her wide-open white eyes seemed to smile vaguely and distantly. I know nothing of time. It all seemed to be 1 second, but a second that lasted hours. Oke stared, then turned round and laughed. "The damned rascal has given me the slip again," he cried, and, quickly unlocking the door, rushed out of the house with dreadful cries. That is the end of the story. Oke tried to shoot himself that evening, but merely fractured his jaw, and died a few days later, raving. There were all sorts of legal inquiries, through which I went as through a dream, and whence it resulted that Mr. Oke had killed his wife in a fit of momentary madness. That was the end of Alice Oke. By the way, her maid brought me a locket which was found round her neck, all stained with blood. It contained some very dark auburn hair, not at all the colour of William Oke's. I am quite sure it was Lovelock's. End of chapter 9. End of A Phantom Lover by Vernon Lee.